All right, there's some seats up front here, like the front row, the very, 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 very front row. So if you're brave enough, you can come up forward so that those that come in later can take the back seats. It's too close. It's too close. Oh, that's the punishment. Okay. If you come in late, you got to sit up front. All right, let's get started. So, a couple of things, sort of housekeeping on the front end. We did the survey on the Arbor Drive Facebook page and asked how many people use the YouVersion Bible app, and there were quite a few. So what we've gone ahead and done is we have added an event for every Wednesday night that has some additional notes, some things that you can talk through, work through on your own, as well as all of the Bible passages that we're going to be using. So like if you have the app in the lower right-hand corner, there's this little more, and then there's a thing that says events, and then you just click on Arbor Drive Community Church, and it takes you there. It's also got like announcements for during the week for from Sunday. Yeah.
If you don't have Facebook, is there a way to get that?
Yeah, it's just the Bible app. The YouVersion Bible app on your phone. It doesn't depend on Facebook at all whatsoever. So if you have the app, you can get the notes. If you have the notes, you can go through them. You can add your own notes. It's got all. You can mark the text that we're using. We're very, very, very high tech now. So with that said, here's the deal. This is not a Sunday school class, okay? I'm going to say this again. This is not a Sunday school class. Here's what I mean by that. This is designed to be interactive and have discussion, and so it's not a lecture or a teaching class type of thing, all right? So envision, if you will, you're sitting in the living room with other members of your family and you're having a discussion, right? It's okay for it to get a little bit rowdy. It's okay to say stuff that somebody's like, I disagree with that, that's fine. The main idea here is that we're engaging with one another and engaging with the Bible. So to that end, what we're talking about for the next little while is discipleship. Now, I know that's like a buzzword in Christendom. And so if you say discipleship, you're like, yeah, I know that. I went through a discipleship program. I have a discipleship process. I have a discipler. I was a disciplee. There's all sorts of different ideas about discipleship, right? Well, what this is about on Wednesday nights is this is about learning from Jesus and how he made disciples. Okay, so Jesus, we're going to look today at two texts primarily. The first one you can turn there is Matthew chapter 4, verse 19. In Matthew 4:19, Jesus calls his disciples, right? And then in Matthew 28, Jesus sends his disciples. So between Matthew 4:19 and Matthew 28 is like 3-ish years. So over the course of that 3 years, something happened, right? Like these guys went from Galilean fishermen, which the Galileans were kind of like hillbillies, right? To Peter preaching the sermon at Pentecost. So what happened? How did he go from a fisherman to a preacher of the gospel that's getting imprisoned and not just getting imprisoned, but singing songs while in prison? You ever thought about how I wouldn't probably do that. I would not be a song singing person if I were imprisoned for the gospel. So what happened there? That's what we're going to be looking at together. So today we're really just going to be looking at these first two texts. So let's read Matthew chapter 4, verse 19. If somebody wants to just read that.
He said to them, "Follow me, and I will turn you into fishers of people."
All right, fishers of men. So follow me, and I will make you, or I will turn you into fishers of men. Like really tiny verse. We're all probably pretty familiar with it, but there's a lot packed into that, right? So what does it mean to follow Jesus? What's he asking them to do? What's he calling them to do? What's he calling you and I to do? Because this isn't just for his disciples, this is for us as well. What is he calling us to do?
Leave everything behind. Their whole life, of course, they were fishermen, but he wanted them to
Yeah. Set everything aside. Now, who's comfortable with that? Who is comfortable with laying everything that, your job, your family, your livelihood, your relationships, your comforts, in Peter's case, your boat and your nets, your, what else? Like your freedom, right? Like following Jesus maybe has some radical implications for some people in this room. Maybe it means going to another culture, another context that doesn't have the gospel, or where you can be in prison for the gospel, right? So who's comfortable with that? Is that a comfortable proposition? Why or why not?
Strange territory.
Strange territory?
Yeah.
Okay, somebody else?
We like to do what we like to do.
We like to do what we like to do, yeah.
Nobody likes change.
We don't like change. We're comfortable, right? We're very comfortable. And in America, how easy is it to be a Christian and be comfortable? Like, are we giving, like, it's pretty easy. Can we all agree on that? Like, if we can agree on that, raise your hand. Okay. It's pretty comfortable to be a Christian in America, or it can be, right? We don't have a lot of persecution. We don't have laws against gathering together. In fact, the country is sort of built around the principle that you get to worship the way you want to, right? So that's dangerous in a sense, because there was a guy named Paul Washer. He was a missionary in Peru, I think, and basically lived in a tent and took the gospel to all of these people that had never heard the gospel before. And he said, it's very easy to follow Jesus when you're living in a tent and depending on him every day for your substance and for your provision. When he came back to America, he said he found it extremely difficult to follow Jesus because you really don't need him all that much. You can do your own thing. None of us in here have probably ever wondered if we're going to have food in the fridge for tomorrow. Probably some of us have thrown away more food in the last week than we care to think about. So, following Jesus is a radically life-altering proposition for these guys. I mean, it means dropping everything and following him. This text is not talking about just following Jesus from place to place, though, right? Have you ever thought about it like that? Like, we often think of following Jesus like, okay, yeah, they dropped their nets, they followed him, they just sort of trailed around after him. You know, they're sort of like, he had his ducks in a row, and he's like, okay, we're going to Samaria. Okay, we'll go to Samaria too, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And they're just sort of trailing around like a little sibling with their big brother or big sister, just following him around on his heels. That's not primarily what he had in mind, is it? What he primarily had in mind is a detachment from their present sphere of interest and an attachment to Jesus as their leader. Right? Think about what are the implications of following Jesus as your leader, not just following him around from place to place.
Being obedient.
Being obedient? Yeah.
Completely obedient.
That's part of it. Yeah, absolutely. He tells us to do something, we do it. What else?
Becoming like him.
What's that?
Becoming like him.
Becoming like him. So there's proximity there too. Right? It's not like these disciples just followed Jesus from a distance, like some of the crowds did. They were up close and personal with him. They were talking to him. They were learning from him. They were engaging with him in conversations. In other words, they were to learn to imitate him. So, how many of us think of discipleship in that way? Discipleship is learning to imitate. What do you typically think of when you think of discipleship? What are some words that come up in your head?
Mentor.
What's that?
Mentor.
Mentor? What else?
Follow, learn.
Okay.
Teacher.
Teacher? Have you ever noticed how when we think about discipleship, we tend to think just up here? Discipleship for us is a process of mental ascent. It's a process of learning information, not becoming like someone. Discipleship for Jesus was very different. He shared information, he taught, right? But what we're going to see is that it was more than just imparting knowledge. There's something that's caught in that process. They begin to model their lives after this person that they admire and love and have affection and love for. So being a disciple then is more than mental assent. Agree or disagree? And why or why not?
What does mental assent?
Mental assent, like I just acknowledge certain things or I understand certain things. So being a disciple is more than just understanding or even believing the right stuff. Yeah, head knowledge. What'd you say?
There's action involved.
Action. Okay, so action. So that knowledge has to somehow make it to something in our lives that looks different, right? Okay, anybody else?
Sorry, hard attitudes, like the way that you feel about people and the way that you perceive things and relate to people, that all changes as well.
All right, so heart is connected now with head and actions, right? Anybody else?
So then,
Yeah, go ahead.
so I would build upon that and say that would be the difference between simple words and true actions
Yeah.
out of the heart.
Have you noticed that you can have like those two things in the extreme, right? I'm a big fan of this concept of like a visual picture for you. You're driving down the road and we used to live in the country and there's those dirt roads and they've got those big ditches, right? The type of ditches that you bottom out in and you need a tow truck to come get you. It's not like a simple like pull back out kind of ditch. Big ditches, okay? So you're driving down this road and there's a ditch on the left and a ditch on the right. The Christian life is, and this is maybe an oversimplification, but the Christian life is all about driving down the middle of the road. We tend to drive into ditches. We're like, hey, I'm going too far this way, and we jerk the wheel. And we go way too far back the other way, right? So you can have somebody that's like, yes, I'm following Jesus because I understand the gospel and I understand what this text says and what this text says, that I've memorized this much scripture and I am this proficient in X, Y, and Z, right? That's a ditch. And you can have another person that's over here that says, I follow Jesus. I do all sorts of, good stuff. I'm a moral person. I don't do really bad things. I do really good things. I'm nice to other people. Well, both of those don't necessarily make you a follower of Jesus. Agreed? The missing piece between those two is the heart. The heart connects those two things together. We're going to see this. So he says, follow me. Right? They had to know something about Jesus to follow him. They had to understand something about him. Ultimately, they followed him because he was the Word made flesh. But they had to know something about him. So there's this aspect of head. So go over to John chapter 14. John 14, 23 to 24. Somebody want to read that? John 14, 23 to 24.
Jesus answered him, Judas Iscariot, if anyone loves me, he'll keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words, and the word that you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me.
So what's the connection between knowing and doing in this text? You have to know the word in order to be able to do the word, right? Know the command in order to be able to do the command. What's the connection between knowing and doing in this text for Jesus?
Loving him.
Love. Affection. Right? There has to be an affection for Jesus. There has to be a love for Jesus. Now, like, American Christianity is in large part becoming what I like to call cold Christianity, right? Christ says later in Matthew that in the time is coming when the love of many will grow cold, right? American Christianity is in very large measure become cold Christianity. What I mean by that is that there's a lack of affection for Jesus, a lack of genuine love for God that produces something. I've got papers for you, apparently. Remind me to give them to you afterwards. Okay. Love for Jesus that actually produces an obedience from the heart, like somebody said over there. It's an obedience from the heart. A heart that treasures Christ. A heart that loves Christ. So we can all sort of understand this, right? If you've had or have middle schoolers are very awkward when it comes to relationships, like especially relationships with the opposite sex. So if they like a girl or like a boy, they'll just act really weird and do weird things. Like, just give them weird stuff or act in really weird ways, like little boys peacock. Like, they'll just sort of like try to do stuff in order to get the girl to notice them or whatever, right? Their affections are driving that. There's an affection for this girl or there's an affection for this boy, and it causes this little boy or little girl to act differently than they normally would, right? In Bambi, it's called being Twitter-pated, right? We just act differently because there's an affection that's influencing the way that we live. All of our lives as Christians are governed by affections. All of our lives as human beings are governed by affections. What the heart wants and longs for is what the heart will pursue. And from the heart flows every single one of our actions. So the problem with American Christianity and a lack of obedience, or an obedience that's detached from any sort of faith, the fundamental problem is a problem of affection. It's not a problem of knowing. In many cases, we know much more than our persecuted brothers and sisters who don't have access to the Bibles. The problem is not knowledge. In fact, American church really does a good job of knowledge and information, right? What we're going to see is that Jesus did something different. He coupled information with relationship and experience. If you want an acronym, if you're an acronym person, REI, like the outdoor company. REI, relationship, experience, and information. That's how Jesus made disciples. Most of us, when we make disciples, we just go to information. If we just transfer the right information, we'll be good. So the first thing we see is head. That's the first element. And then he says, I will make you. There's a transformation that happens. Who makes them fishers of men? Jesus, right? He doesn't say, come follow me and you can make yourselves into fishers of men. The necessary consequence of following Jesus is you will become a fisher of men. That's what Jesus is saying. Agree or disagree? Which means that, now let's work this backwards. If we're not fishers of men, we're not following Jesus. Agree or disagree? Come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. If you're not fishing for men, you haven't been made into that because you're not following. That kind of stings a little bit at times, right? If we think about it, that kind of hurts. See, Jesus is not content with intellectual assent alone. He's transforming these people to produce them, or to produce in them something that wasn't there before, so that they can go and carry on the mission. So the difference between Matthew 4 and Matthew 28 is they were following Jesus and he made them into fishers of men. There's transformation that leads to action. So head, heart, hands, right? We understand, it roots in our heart. We have affections and loves and desires that influence how we live. That's what being a disciple is all about. You see how we overcomplicate stuff so much? Like we overcomplicate things in a lot of cases, and we turn discipleship into a program rather than a process. We say, if I do X, Y, Z, boom, I'm good to go. When Christ's model is, follow me and I'm going to do something in you that's going to result in transformed living. So, there's something that that's interesting here also. Did Jesus say, get yourselves together and then come follow me? Do we sometimes act like that with other people? Like, genuine question, let's discuss. Yes or no? If so, how do we do that?
Can you kind of define that a little bit more? It's pretty broad.
Yeah, like, so do we ever have the attitude of, this person is way beyond anything that I can do for them? If they just a little bit more moral, a little bit more, their attitude was maybe a little bit better, if they had their life together a little bit more, then maybe I could do something with this. All right, I'm thinking in particular, maybe one of the ways that this manifests itself non-intentionally is in parenting. I mean, do we ever bring that attitude into parenting? You need to clean yourself up and then you're accepted by me. There's a whole lot of people in my generation that have been hurt and wounded by parenting like that. And I'm pretty sure this is the same for every generation. Do we look at people that maybe we see that come into our doors here at Arbor Drive and say, I'm not going to talk to that person, they look a little sketchy?
They're not meeting people where they're at.
What's that?
They're not meeting people where they're at.
Yeah.
Well, I would add to that too. I mean, it's, as a mom with young children, having a child that I don't have time to address this issue right now. I don't have time to invest in this specific topic. I don't have time to answer 10 million questions on the car ride home because I'm deep in my thoughts. You know, I think it's, and then parents lose time.
Yeah.
So you miss that time, you miss that opportunity, that moment that God's given you, and you pray that He gives you another one. But I think if you're not careful, so many parents, the years just fade by, and now you have a teenager you can't relate to.
Yeah.
That you don't know intimately, and now you come along because maybe they're rebellious, and they're like, when did you decide to show up and parent?
Yeah.
Which is sad, and I just think you just really have to gut check yourself.
Yeah.
Like those are, in my opinion, that's the easiest way, that's the easiest gift God's given us to disciple.
Yeah.
It's such an intimate relationship. He's blessed you with these little humans that look to you.
And they're right there.
Right.
They're right in your home.
Ample opportunities to disciple them.
Yeah. Well, even when we consider other people and relationships with other people, one of the things we're going to see is that Jesus went to the people that were broken and outcast. Not just the people that were internally broken and outcast, but the people that were externally broken and outcast, right? Because we're all broken. But what we can tend to do is look on the outside and say, well, at least I'm not that broken. At least it's not that visible, right? Especially in a small town where there's a lot of pressure to look a certain way or to be perceived a certain way. So Jesus doesn't say, fix yourself, get yourself cleaned up, and then come follow me. Transform yourself, and then you're okay to come and hang out with me. He says, to Peter, who's going to deny him 3 times in his most painful hours, you come follow me. I'm going to do something in your life. I'm going to transform you. I'm going to change you.
Hey, John,
Yeah.
this is an obvious one about the external appearance, but go back to the one about the parent, and I missed that one about, you said about especially millennial parents, and what was the point about parents? What was the parenting?
Yeah, like so as parents, we can be tempted to be focused on how our children look on the outside, and that then is the basis for their acceptance. So sort of that ducks in a row, like we all walk in and everybody's happy, da da da.
The pastor's kids have to be like that.
Yeah.
Not the rest of them.
Well, I wasn't gonna say that, but that is one. Like that is one, and so yeah, that is one. Let's marinate on that one for a second.
That's why you sit in the back.
Yeah. Yeah, so absolutely. The pastor's kids, they need to be cleaned up, they need to look good, they need to follow the rules, toe the line. And really what everybody needs is to be transformed. Everybody needs a new heart. Everybody needs new affections, new desires, new loves, new motivations. And so we're gonna skip some of this stuff. You can go look at it in the notes on the YouVersion app, but let's take a look at let's define a disciple then, just from Matthew 4:19. A disciple is someone who is following Christ. That's the head piece. That is being changed by Christ. That's the heart piece. And someone who is committed to the mission of Christ. That's the hands piece. So following Christ, being changed by Christ, and on mission with Christ. Okay? Notice I said being changed. Right? We're all being changed at different rates. We're going to see that the disciples grew at different rates. So, how did the men respond? Look at Matthew 4, verses 20 through 22.
They didn't hesitate.
What's that?
They did not hesitate.
Yeah, they didn't hesitate. They dropped everything. Right? They dropped their nets. And they started following. They just ran after him. What causes somebody to do that? Maybe let me put that a different way. What prevents you from doing that?
Pride.
What?
Pride.
Pride? Okay, explain that.
I'm not in a place where I need to drop everything right now.
Okay. So like a pride of self-dependence? Okay. Anybody else?
Feeling of other obligations.
Okay. Expand on that a little bit.
So, I mean, when I think of that, I would think that, okay, what would help me to do that? Or when would I do that? If there was an emergency,
Yeah.
then I would drop everything and go. If I got a phone call that my kid was in emergency, I would drop everything and go.
Yeah.
But why wouldn't I anyway? Because I feel obligation to other things in life,
Okay.
maybe.
Yeah. There's
Kids, family, kids,
Yeah.
parents, responsibilities, work.
other responsibilities, other things in life that are holding on to us. Okay. Well, you said something that I think was really profound. You said if somebody calls and there's somebody in the hospital, you drop everything and go. So maybe one of the things that holds us back is urgency. You know, for some people, it's like, well, I'm pretty healthy. I'll get serious about Jesus later. I don't necessarily want to be one of those weirdos that's always talking about him, or that gets a bad rap from their coworkers. I'll get into that later. So urgency. What else? Anybody else?
That's similar to having priorities, obviously.
Priorities, yeah. Yeah.
You've been dancing around the fear of rejection.
Yeah. That's a big one.
You might try to minister.
Fear of rejection, fear of judgment,
Uncertainty, fear of
Uncertainty? Yeah, absolutely. Security? Right? So if you're following along in the app, there's a little picture here, and it says, the fact that the disciples immediately dropped everything to follow Jesus teaches us that the joy and security found in following him surpasses the joy and security that the world has to offer. Let's think about that for a second. The joy and security, two things that we're all pursuing. You know, joy and security. I'm going to work so that I can earn money, so that I can retire, so that I can have everything that I ever wanted and go do everything I ever wanted to do, and then I'll be happy. Joy and security are powerful motivators for us. And the disciples dropping everything show us something. They show that the joy and security of following Christ far surpasses the joy and security that they might have had with their little fishing boats and silly nets. Now, what type of joy and security did Peter experience later on after Jesus left and went back up to heaven? What were some of the things that happened to Peter?
All people had to do was touch him.
What's that?
All people had to do was touch him and they were healed.
And then on top of that, yeah, and on top of that though, like he goes from there to being in prison and to getting beaten and getting rebuked by Paul and having this church in Jerusalem that's doing really well, and all of a sudden persecution rises up and things don't necessarily go that well for Peter. We're told that Peter ended up being crucified upside down, right? So if that's the joy and security that Christ offers,
There's an eternal security.
exactly, it's more than temporal. It's more than just this life. There's an eternal security. So Psalm 16:11, one of my favorite passages. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Joy and security. Like,
Isn't that the most difficult thing to get to, is looking in a spiritual, eternal perspective,
mm-hmm.
and leaving this, life as we know it. But why, is that really what we're called to?
Yeah. Well, and the disciples had to learn this, right? So they come back and they're like, hey, Jesus, should we call down fire from heaven on these people? And he's just like, how long? Right? They had to learn it. Peter, when Christ was being crucified, was not content with the joy and security of following Jesus, right? So they had to learn it. But them leaving their nets teaches us something about that. Let's go on and let's look at Matthew 28, 19 to 20. We've just got a couple more minutes. And so what we're going to do is, the way this is going to work is, if we don't get through stuff, we'll just pick it up next week and continue on. It's not like it's a lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. We're just going to start looking at different experiences that Jesus had with his disciples and start pulling some lessons about discipleship from those. Matthew 28, 19 to 20. Should be very familiar with this here at Arbor Drive. Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So Jesus called his disciples to replicate what he had done in their lives, in the lives of others. Isn't it interesting that he just says, go make disciples? And it's like, how? What do I do with that, Jesus? Where's the blueprint? I need a book. I need 17 points on how to make disciples. I need a 4-point process on how to make disciples so I know I'm doing this right. How did they know how to make disciples? Not rhetorical. How did they know how to make disciples? Because they were disciples. Now, they were, like, Ben and I have had a lot of conversations about discipleship. And I know that there were certain people that really invested in Ben's life. Do you want to know how I can tell in what ways they invested in his life? By looking at how he does the same thing. We tend to replicate what we've experienced. So discipleship is caught more than it's taught. We learn more about discipleship from being in an experience where we're being discipled than we do from sitting down and reading a book, even though there's a plethora of books on this topic. And the sad thing is a lot of Christians haven't experienced that. And now they've been walking with the Lord for 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, having never experienced any sort of discipleship relationship, and pride creeps in, and they're afraid or unwilling to go to somebody and say, hey, I need somebody to invest in my life. I need someone to come alongside of me and help me grow in my faith. And so people that haven't experienced discipleship limp along like weak, bleeding sheep that are pretending to not be wounded and trying to keep up with the rest of the flock. When all that needs to happen is for somebody to come and pick that sheep up and carry them for a little bit and teach them how to walk and give them time to heal. Pride is a powerful inhibitor. I've talked to people that have been walking with the Lord and never been taught on baptism and therefore never been baptized. You want to know what the number one thing I hear is? If I get baptized, it's going to seem like I've been living a lie for the last 20 years. If you refuse to follow in obedience to the command of the Lord when you're shown it after 20 years, it's showing that the last 20 years was a lie. You see the difference there? The gospel humbles us. We all need discipleship. I can not tell you how much I have benefited from the discipleship of other guys that are on the elder board in my 5 years here. So, we've got just like a minute or two left. And let's just end tonight with this. We'll come back and finish up the Great Commission and start looking at some of the examples of Christ interacting with his disciples next week. And let's end with this. Where has God placed you in order to make disciples? Right? Just something to think about. I want you guys to think about this week. Where has God placed you in order to make disciples? Is it whether it's being a parent and placing children in your home, which is like just a gimme. That's like a mulligan. It's just like right there in front of you. You can't miss that opportunity. They're stuck in your home. They're prisoners for 18 years. Slowly working their way out of the prison and gaining independence little bit by little bit, but you've got them in your home, right? Maybe it's a close friend that you regularly get together with that doesn't know Christ, or somebody that's one of those sheep that's limping along and needs somebody to come alongside of them. Maybe you're that sheep and you need somebody, right? Where are the discipleship opportunities in your life? Like, I really believe that if you guys stick with this on Wednesday nights, we're going to see some incredible things about the way that Jesus makes disciples. Things that not only take the focus off of us and our own ability to do it, but place it on confidence in God and His Spirit and the fact that He does this work through us. But also maybe dispelling some of these myths or ideas about discipleship that we've built up in our minds that make it seem like this impossible task that we can never do. Like, we give it all away. You can come back and we can look at it more together if you want to, but discipleship is about taking ordinary opportunities to point people to God. That's all it is. It's not a program, it's a process. It's not necessarily taught, it's caught. So, we'll come back next week and we'll cover Starting in, I'll have a new event set up with all of the details that we haven't gone over yet, and then some more stuff. If you have that YouVersion app, you can save this. Otherwise, it's going to go away tomorrow. If you want to save it, save your notes that you've been writing or anything like that, you can do that. We'll pick up next time. And so I'm going to ask you guys this week to be thinking about discipleship opportunities. If you have questions next time about stuff we've covered, we can cover that. Like, please feel free to interrupt if you have a question or think something or whatever. Like, I tend to talk if there's silence because I get awkward. And yeah, so again, I want this to be interactive. This is not a Sunday school class. This is an opportunity for us to encourage one another and learn from one another and look at the text together. So, any final thoughts before we end? All right. Feel free to hang out, right? We're limiting this to an hour to honor your time, especially if you've got kids that you need to get home to get to bed. But feel free to hang out and fellowship. And please come back next week as we continue to look at how Jesus made disciples. Yes. And Amanda gave me cards for you guys. So here you go. Here you go.